and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to present our guest today. This is the first in the signature, so to speak, series of Last, the Café break series, and well, before introducing the speaker, I just would like to let you know, in case you don't know, that there will be our welcome reception right after the talk, right here, so you don't have to move or to go very far for that. So I hope that you will stay also for the reception. Going back to our talk today, I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Johanna Birnir from the Department of Government and Politics here at the University of Maryland. She's an associate professor in this department, and she's also the research director of the Center of International Development and Conflict Management. And she, before coming to the University of Maryland, she taught for a number of years at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and she holds an MA and a PhD in political science from the University of California at Los Angeles. Her research is in the field of comparative politics, and with a focus on political developments in new democracies in Latin America and Eastern Europe. And she is more concretely, more specifically, she studies the effects of institutions on party system development and ethnic politics, with a special emphasis on conflict and terrorism. She is the author of a book called Ethnicity and Electoral Politics, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. She has published also numerous articles on party politics, party systems, the interaction, electoral politics, and so on and so forth. And she is currently working on a book with a tentative title of Violence and Electoral Politics, which is going to be also a comparative study of the effects of violence on electoral politics in Latin America and other countries outside Latin America, such as Liberia, Turkey, and Northern Ireland. So today she is going to be talking about, the title of her talk is Voting in the Shadow of Violence, Electoral Politics and Conflict, focusing in the case of Peru. So welcome, Professor Birnir, and it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Thanks for a great turnout. It's my pleasure to be here at the Café break. And it's particularly nice that there's a reception afterwards, so I understand it's not just for me, but it's good to see all of you here today. And I see a number of my students here today. I'm assigning this paper in the course I'm teaching, so you'll get the brief introduction. You won't have to actually read the paper. So the paper is the first part of this project, and it's written with Anita Goes at the University of Mannheim, and as Alejandro was mentioning, I'm hoping that this will turn into a book eventually, where I look at Peru in greater depth, and then do some comparisons with other countries around the world. But for a first stab of this, we're looking, Anita and I, at presidential elections only in Peru, and that's part of the project that I'm going to be presenting here today. So what I will do today is I will tell you about the general motivations behind this project. I'll tell you a little bit about the prior work on this topic, both my own prior work in the area and sort of other people's prior work on this topic specifically. I'll discuss the theory in some detail, and this theory is a theory that doesn't specifically pertain to Peru, but is hopefully generalizable to other cases as well. Then I will talk in some detail about why we chose to focus on Peru in this study. I'll show you the results from the Peruvian case analysis, and then in my conclusion I'll think a little bit about the generalizability and future directions of the study. So the motivation behind the study, the primary motivation behind this study centers on electoral accountability. And in political science, we're used to the notion that in electoral politics, incumbents get held accountable for the types of things that they do. They're generally held accountable for policies that they pass and other activities that they do while they're in office. But recently, this notion of electoral accountability has come under fire in countries where incumbents are perpetrating significant amounts of violence and are often on the record as having perpetrated significant amounts of violence. And the question that has been posed is, if electoral accountability is an accurate idea, that we really do punish incumbents when we perceive them having failed in office, why is it then that we see incumbents re-elected oftentimes when they themselves have gone on record saying that they have perpetrated violence? The cases that are cited in this puzzle are numerous, ranging from the United States, all of the activity that's ongoing in Guantanamo Bay, but other cases that pertain more to local domestic electoral politics are cases like that of Liberia, where Charles Taylor was elected on an election cry of he killed my ma, he killed my pa, I will vote for him. So this begs the corollary question, is coercion perhaps an effective strategy for increasing popular support? Are we entirely wrong about electoral accountability in situations where there is violence? And so this puzzle and this question is really the motivation, the fundamental motivation for our study. We also think that there are a number of reasons we should care about the examination of elections under conditions of violence that go beyond the electoral accountability question. Parties that are affiliated with insurgents are often often very influential regional parties in countries that are engaged in civil conflict, but they tend to be understudied because primary focus has been on the major players in these civil conflicts that tend to be incumbent parties. Conflicts that are civil conflicts are often very costly in terms of economics and lives lost. So these aren't trivial questions. The politics in these countries is not a trivial question. Studying voting behavior, particularly as it relates to incumbent parties, gives us what we think is a more direct direct flow of information about popular sentiment than studies so far have been able to give. And what I mean by that is that thinking about insurgencies and how to counteract insurgencies today centers on the idea that you really have to involve the local population in this effort if efforts against insurgencies are supposed to be effective. But it's oftentimes very difficult to gauge exactly how the local population feels, how they feel about the insurgent, how they feel about the incumbent. And we suggest in this paper that looking at vote behavior as it pertains to incumbent-affiliated parties and to insurgency-affiliated parties is useful information that can tell us something about how the local population feels about insurgents and incumbents. And there are very many countries all over the world that hold what we call reasonably free and fair elections under conditions of violence. There's a study that's coming out in the British Journal of Political Science that argues that over a third of recent elections held in over 2/3 of recent elections held in countries where there is civil conflict are actually reasonably free and fair, that there's a minority of countries that are holding elections at the same time as they're embroiled in civil conflict, where those elections cannot be considered reasonably free and fair. Now, it's important to note that what I mean by reasonably free and fair is not the same as we think of necessarily in the United States. Reasonably free and fair, I'll get into the definition of that, but this is a continuum, and so we call it reasonably free and fair for a reason. Previous research is plentiful on the effect of elections on violence. This includes my own work, where I examined the effect of grievances related to access, ethnic group access into office, on the probability of subsequent violence by the group. I'm not the only one. There are many people that have studied this. Explanations for why elections sometimes lead to subsequent violence range from grievance to spoiler effects, and there are many other explanations. More recently, scholars have started studying the effect of violence on political motivations, and this is a much more recent trend in the literature. Wood studies the effect of violence in El Salvador on the effect of subsequent mobilization against the incumbent black men. Bells and Miguel examine political motivation in Africa, Balcells in Spain. But this is an emerging literature. There isn't a whole lot of there aren't a whole lot of studies in this area still. Of the authors that focus specifically on the effect of violence on subsequent voting, there are sort of two camps in the literature. The first one examines election-related violence and coercion specifically. So what happens when political actors engage in election-related violence, election-related coercion, like what's taking place in Sri Lanka right now, where it is alleged that government forces just tried to coerce Tamils from voting for Tamil parties by actually going to the homes of participants of politicians that were running in the elections and intimidating those politicians to drop out or intimidate voters not to vote for them. We know many cases where this is the case. So this is one part of the literature, Wilkinson, Johnson, Mason, Collier, Vincent, and many others that focus on election-related violence that's specifically aimed at coercing the vote that's taking place. And then there is the second part of this literature that's interested not so much in the violence surrounding elections, but rather violence that precedes the election. So not violence that aims at coercing you to vote one way or another, but rather violence that has taken place in the country prior to the election. And this paper is in that camp. We're not interested in the election violence that aims to coerce someone to vote a particular way or another. We're interested in the violence that took place between elections and how voters are commenting on that violence in their ballot choices. Our theory builds on a lot of prior studies, but in particular, there is an emerging direction in political science that emphasizes spatial location. And there's a forthcoming study that suggests that proximate violence motivates very differently than distant violence. And we build on this notion. And this doesn't just pertain to violence. This pertains to many areas of politics, where the idea is making inroads that where you are in relation to whatever is happening affects the way that you behave in politics. And we know that conflict violence generally tends to be quite localized, so we think that this is a particularly important premise to think about. We know also that from social identity theory that people distinguish between members of in-groups and out-groups, and we capitalize on this notion to think about how that, what effect that has in under violent conditions. And finally, we assume that elections are a relatively low-cost way of expressing political preferences. And what I mean by relatively is that if you live in a conflict-ridden country, it is, and you have the option of voting in reasonably free and fair elections where the ballot is secret, then there are lower costs associated with that than there are with protesting in the street in public view where everybody can see what side you're on and so forth. And therefore we think that it's a reasonable assumption that that people will choose to register their preferences in elections, even though they may not register their preferences in more direct ways or more public ways. There are a number of actors in our argument. In particular, we're interested in the incumbent and the party of the incumbent, the insurgent and insurgency-affiliated parties, and the voter himself. Now, the voter is motivated by a relationship with a victim, and we are especially interested in victims that are members of the voter in-group or are unknown to the voter. We think that there are very different dynamics that come into play when a voter observes an out-group member victimized. In many cases that are different from the case that we're going to be analyzing, we think that it's likely that a voter observing violence perpetrated against an out-group member may want to reward the perpetrator of the violence against the out-group member, particularly if the out-group is considered threatening to the voter. So we are interested especially in victims that are members of the voter in-group or unknown to the voter. And we don't necessarily think that the voter has to have experienced the violence him or herself. Recent literature suggests that for political motivation, Blattman suggests that for political motivation, people don't necessarily have to have experienced violence themselves to be motivated for political action, but they have to have observed violence in somewhere in their surroundings. So the argument then is that voters who observe violence being perpetrated against their in-group members are likely to distinguish the perpetrator of that violence and seek to punish the perpetrator of that violence at the polls. So this is voters who see or know of violence locally perpetrated against the members of their in-group. They're going to want to find out who perpetrated that violence, and they're going to try to punish that perpetrator in local elections. And this, we think, holds true for perpetrators, whether they are insurgent affiliated, whether they are the insurgents, and then the voter would punish the insurgent affiliated party, or if the perpetrator is the incumbent, we believe that the voter will seek to punish the incumbent party. In contrast, we think that voters who are far removed from the violence have different concerns than the voters in the midst of the violence. We think the voters that are far removed from the violence, they have less information than voters that are in the midst of the violence. It's often very difficult for them to know precisely who perpetrated the violence. They know that there was violence being perpetrated, that the incumbent and the insurgent are involved in it, but they don't know specifically who's perpetrating more or less of the violence. They don't know exactly who is the victim. They know that there is a victim, but they don't know necessarily that victim. And therefore their concerns are slightly different from voters that are in the midst of the violence. What they're going to be concerned with, we hypothesize, is that the violence is not threatening them, in that it's not moving closer, in that the incumbent is containing the violence. They're concerned with containment of the violence primarily. If the incumbent is containing the violence, we don't think that the voter is going to punish the incumbent. But if the voter doesn't see the incumbent contain the violence, chances are that that voter, we hypothesize, will want to hold the incumbent responsible for not containing the violence and will want to punish that incumbent at the polls. So the insurgent, in turn, where the victim is the insurgent and the insurgent-affiliated parties, in turn, where victims are unknown, the insurgent will generally not get punished, we argue. So this leads to two specific hypotheses. We hypothesize that parties associated with insurgent movements that perpetrate violence locally will suffer loss of electoral support locally. The incumbent, however, that is perceived as failing to stem the violence will suffer vote loss across cases. So the incumbent will be punished locally if he or she is perpetrating the violence locally, and he will suffer vote loss from afar for failing to stem the violence. So the empirical expectations of this are that insurgency-affiliated parties lose support in localities where they perpetrate violence. This is true for incumbents also. They lose support in localities where they perpetrate the violence. But incumbents also lose support in localities where they're not perpetrating violence, whereas insurgents do not. Now, who the winner is, we don't know precisely. Winners in localities where violence is being perpetrated is either going to be a peaceful incumbent, a peaceful insurgent affiliated party, or a peaceful third party. It can be any of these actors if they're peaceful and are not being punished locally. And the winner in localities where no violence is being perpetrated in the remote locations, far away, is either going to be the insurgent-affiliated party or the third party, because the incumbent in areas that are remote, in the sense that they're far away from the violence, is going to be punished in those areas. So that's the theory. Now let me turn to why we are choosing to test this theory on Peru. Peru experienced violent conflict across 2 decades or more, depending on how you define the boundaries of the violence. At the same time, the country held reasonably free and fair elections. And this is where I get back to my definition of reasonably free and fair. Clearly, elections in Peru were not free and fair like we experience elections in the United States. There was a lot of violence associated with the elections. There were a number of places where polling actually didn't take place because of the violence. And one of the parties had the explicit objective of disrupting elections. So what we mean by free and fair is what has become accepted as a standard in the political science literature looking at elections in developing countries, particularly in conflict-ridden countries. And that is that there was executive turnover. So the executive changed hands in both elections. And the idea here is that had the incumbent that controlled the elections wanted to perpetrate enough fraud to stay in office, the incumbent could have done so. The fact that the incumbent didn't is taken as evidence that the ballot was reasonably free and fair. Because incumbents, as we know, incumbent politicians, their primary objective is to stay in office. And so if they are losing office, then we take that as evidence that there was some amount of freedom to cast ballot against that incumbent. Furthermore, election participation in Peru was mandatory in during this time. And this is particularly important because most of the violence took place in the Andes, where the impoverished indigenous population is concentrated. And the elections, if abstentions weren't punished by immediate fines, but what happened if you abstained was that you couldn't get government services. So if you needed some documentation or you needed to register for something, you were denied those services until you paid a very hefty fine. And as a consequence, others have made the argument that during this time, the impoverished indigenous that could not well afford to pay this fine turned out despite the violence. And it's true that turnout fluctuated quite a bit, but they did turn out in much greater numbers than they otherwise might have had those not been mandatory. And this is very useful for us for testing because we are interested in the people and the preferences of the people that turn out to cast their vote at the polls. And finally, the left party that was arguably associated with the insurgency in these two elections increased its support at the national level in the 1985 elections. And this runs contrary to our hypothesis. We're arguing that insurgent-affiliated parties should lose votes in the localities where they're perpetrating violence. And the aggregate evidence suggests that we're wrong. So either we're right, and the aggregate evidence is hiding the local effect, or we're wrong, and we will find out. But this is, in any case, a very tough test, we think, of our hypothesis. So the first problem that we face in trying to test these hypotheses in Peru is that violence measures are notoriously unreliable in conflict situations, and Peru is no exception. There's a very interesting graph that I've seen from Guatemala at the height of the genocide in Guatemala that was plotted for journalistic reports that were supposedly accounting for the number of people being killed during the height of the genocide, and the line is completely flat. Well, that's because journalists had figured out that if they reported on the number of people killed, they were going to be next. And so they just didn't report in Guatemala on the number of people that were being killed. And the same is true for Peru. This graph shows you, and I know you can't read the legend, but what's important is to see the variance in the bars. This here reports by province the number of people reported as killed between 1980 and 1989 by three independent agencies. The one is the Peruvian Truth Commission. Second is the Ombudsman's Office, and the third is a collection of three NGOs. And for every single province, the estimates of these three independent varied extremely much. And this is true in general for conflict situations. Conflict data is difficult to come by, it's difficult to collect. The people that you're trying to get information on are often dead or too frightened to talk. There may not be anybody that can go into conflict situations. And is there somebody that wants to come in? Sorry. I've been seeing him outside of the door, and you're awfully polite.
That's exactly what I didn't want to do.
Yeah, no, you should have not. I just saw your face. Sorry, I should have spoken something sooner. Anyway, so violence data is notoriously difficult to come by and collect. People that you want to collect information are not there, and so on. So what we did for this is we took advantage of a method that's called capture-recapture. And this is a method that has been used in epidemiology and demography to estimate closed populations where you can't get accurate data on the populations themselves. And essentially, the intuition behind this capture-recapture technique is that if you have 3 independent lists of people that were killed during a conflict, then you can overlay these lists in such a way that you can first of all figure out who is commonly accounted for in all 3 lists. And then you can deduplicate, make sure you don't have any overlapping records. Then you can figure out who's accounted for in only 2 lists and not in the 3rd. And using that information, you can estimate who's going to be missing overall from the 3rd list. And you can use any 2 lists to estimate this information for the 3rd list. And then you can use all 3 lists together to estimate who you're missing from the entire population. And fortunately for us, there was a human rights group that worked with the Truth Commission with the Truth Commission in Peru to do this estimate at the national level in Peru. And their estimates were that rather than the number of killed being somewhere in the 20,000s, they were actually closer to the 70,000s. So we took this national estimate that had already been done by the Truth Commission in Peru and did the estimates at the provincial level, because we're interested in the local effect of violence on election outcomes. And here you see maps of the 3 sources that we used, and you see the variation by region. This is the area of the country where most of the violence was being committed. So this is the Truth Commission data, the NGO data, and the Ombudsman's office. And then this is our estimate at the provincial level, following the same technique that the Truth Commission used themselves, to estimate the number of people that were killed by province. And there are a couple of things to note here. First of all, our estimate is clearly higher than any of the individual estimates. That's consistent with the national level results. And it's not simply a linear scale of any of the other estimates. So you couldn't just take the Truth Commission data, for example, and use that as a proxy. You really need to do this estimation independently. So having generated this data at the provincial level, for the explanatory variable, which is the estimated number of killed and disappeared individuals per 1,000 inhabitants for each province, we then took the vote share we then matched that up with the vote share for each of the party in each of the 194 provinces in the presidential elections in 1985 and 1990. The reason we started with presidential elections is because Peru is a presidential democracy, and those are considered the most significant elections politically. We would expect to see the same effect for deputies and also maybe in municipal elections. And in my larger project, that's something that I would like to explore further. We also controlled for turnout. because under violent conditions, even though the vote was mandatory, there are going to be a number of people that don't turn out. And we control for blank ballots, and this is going to become important, as I'll show you later. And these are to be distinguished from spoiled ballots. They're not the same as spoiled ballots. These are blank ballots that people cast because they don't want to vote for any of the other parties. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Peruvian electoral story, I just want to give you some background. The Partido Comunista Peruano is the party that we hypothesize is closely, or that we argue is closely associated with Sendero. This party ran with Izquierda Socialista in 1985 and 1990. And it's important to note here that the history of the Partido Comunista and Sendero is that the Sendero was a violent offshoot of the PCP. Once the Sendero had come into being and become independent from the PCP, the two actually went through great effort to distance themselves from each other. So the Sendero would come out and publicly say, A, they didn't want people to participate in elections, and B, that the PCP was not there representing them. And the PCP would also say, well, you know, we're clearly not representing the Sendero Luminoso, we're a peaceful political party. We think that the Peruvians that were voting, like their counterparts in so many countries, likely did not buy this argument entirely. The Spanish government didn't buy this argument in the case of Haripata-Suna and ETA. Sinn Féin and IRA continually try to distance themselves from each other, but you have members running in the party that belong to the violent movement. And even if voters did buy this to some extent, the PCP and the Sendero still represented the different radicalizations of the same ideology. So at the minimum, voters that object to the PCP are rejecting that extremist leftist ideology. The other contenders in the election in 1985 were Belonde's Acción Popular, which was replaced by Alan Garcia's APRA, and APRA actually won 53.1% of the vote. And the IU, the Izquierda Unida, that was the coalition PCP ran in 1985, increased its vote share from somewhere around 12% to 24% nationally in the 85 election. Then in 1990, APRA, winning 22.5%, was replaced by Fujimori's Cambio 90, that won 29.1% in the first round. The winner, the overall winner in the first round was actually Mario Vargas Llosa Fredemo, that included the AP, but in the second round, Cambio 90 won a plurality of the vote against Fredemo. At this time, the IU had fractured into the Izquierda Unida and Izquierda Socialista, and these fragmented parties now only received 12.9% of the vote. But this is really important for us, this fragmentation, because it provides an additional test for our hypothesis, as I'll show you later. So let me now go to some of the results. So this is the effect, this is the expected effect of increasing violence on provincial vote share in the 1985 elections. And this is the IU, this is the incumbent AP, and this is APRA, the challenger. Remember, we hypothesized that we know from the aggregate electoral story that the incumbent lost. The incumbent lost the election. But we hypothesized that the effect of violence, of increasing violence, would be minimal on that vote loss because the incumbent was losing votes everywhere, both from afar and in the localities. Well, that's what this line shows us. There's no significantly different effect of killings per 1,000 inhabitants on the vote share that's received by the incumbent in this election that we can tell. In contrast, there is a significant difference between the vote share received by the IU in areas where there were no killings and in areas with a higher number of people killed. Now, the effect of AFRA is not clear. It seems that the vote shares of all parties were depressed because of the violence, but it's very hard to tell because the confidence intervals are so large. I can't really say much about that. But we think that this provides pretty good support for our hypothesis. The other thing that came out of this study that we find pretty interesting is the effect of on blank ballots. So this shows you here the number of blank ballots in strongholds of the IU. And you see, this is the IU here. And as the vote share for IU increases in a province, or sorry, in a province, the number of blank ballots goes up very significantly also. What we think this means is that there clearly was voter intimidation ongoing, and not everybody was comfortable casting their vote for one of the contenders. And likely in the Andes, where the IU strongholds tended to be, Sendero's presence was likely stronger, and that's likely, and there likely you see greater voter intimidation. Then if we look at the 1990 election, this is the expected effect of increasing violence on provincial vote share in the 1990 election. Here, the effect on the incumbent, APRA, is actually statistically significant. And this is really interesting. We think that this may be because in 1985, Alan Garcia came in on this platform of increasing protection of human rights and sort of criticizing the Belonde regime very, very strongly for failing to protect human rights. And in the first couple of years of his administration, the number of deaths and disappeared decreased quite a bit. But then Sendero regrouped and started attacking forcefully again, and the incumbent responded in kind and then some. And so the numbers of killed and disappeared skyrocketed again. And we think perhaps, and this is pure speculation here, that, that some voters in the Andes were persuaded in the 1985 election to vote for Alan Garcia because of this promise of increasing protection of human rights. And then once the regime reneged on its promises, voters were in the high violence areas were disgusted with the party and left for other parties. Therefore, perhaps we're seeing a significant effect on the incumbent party. Again, the effect is noticeable for the IU, the left coalition, and it's hard to tell, but it is significantly different from levels of no violence to high violence. But the more moderate leftist offshoot is not affected at all. This is the more moderate izquierda socialista that broke off from the IU and does not contain the PCP, which is the party that is most closely associated with the Sendero. They are not affected at all by the violence. So people weren't defecting generally from the left. They were defecting very specifically from the Izquierda Unida. Again, blank ballots tell us an interesting story. There's clearly voter intimidation going on. But here, the voter intimidation is evident both in strongholds of the Izquierda Unida and in the strongholds of the incumbent. So the incumbent here, so it's likely that the 1990 elections were somewhat more questionable than the 1985 elections in terms of how free and fair they were. Now we think that the substantive effect of the vote loss on the left is quite substantial. This picture here shows you, this map here shows you the difference between the projected vote loss, the difference between the projected vote gain in areas of high violence, had there been no violence, and the actual votes that were received. So this difference is the difference in votes that were lost because there was significant violence. So substantively, we think that this had a very substantial effect on the political futures of the left in Peru. So in conclusion, we think that this project shows that political parties that are associated with insurgent groups are indeed systematically punished where the group penetrates violence, and they're punished in proportion to the scale of violence. The location of violence clearly affects vote decisions. The type of perpetrator affects vote decisions. We think that victim identity affects vote decisions, but only locally. If you don't know the victim, if the victim is distant, you don't have the information to distinguish in the same way that a voter locally does. So bringing us back to the electoral accountability, what does this tell us about the story of electoral accountability? Well, the good news is that electoral accountability under violence still does exist. Voters that are caught in the midst of the violence, that are personally affected by the violence, in that their in-group members are victimized by the violence, they do hold the perpetrator accountable. The bad news is that violence tends to be very localized, and so this oftentimes does not manifest in aggregate results, because the great majority of voters often live pretty far from the violence, and they're more concerned with the incumbent holding the violence at bay. Future directions of this work. The next step is to look at Peru more closely, the effect of deputies and the effect of on local politics, what happened in municipal politics as a result of the violence, and then perhaps to look at other countries and see if the effect of violence on voting tells us the same story or a different story. I think that the story is likely the same or similar in Turkey, Liberia, and Ireland, but I think there's a different story to be told in Guatemala, and that I think is going to be very interesting, but of a very different nature because of the number of people killed and other factors that differ between Peru and Guatemala. I think with that I will conclude and open up for questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions, comments, observations.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on this idea of reasonably free and fair elections in Peru, because I think if the elections are not legitimate, then the results that we gather from them are complicated a little bit, and I apologize for making a multi-part question, but using this idea of executive turnover is interesting, because I think in Latin America there are personalistic and junta-style regimes, and even in some of the most violent and oppressive governments, you see the executive willingly turn over power, whether it's Argentina or El Salvador or elsewhere. So executive turnover might not be the only indicator of reasonably free and fair elections, because you can have a different mask on the same face. And then the other part about reasonably free and fair that I thought was interesting was that it's compared relative to the United States. And maybe in the 18th, 19th, or even 20th century, the United States might have been a model for electoral democracy. But in the 21st century, we've seen Latin American countries like Brazil using participatory budgeting, or Venezuela using a very accurate technical voting system make strides that surpass the democratic system in place in the U.S. Also, given that we're living in an era of Citizens United and the new Jim Crow, using the U.S. as a model is problematic, I think. And then thirdly, because the U.S. is a sponsor of state terrorism and paramilitary terrorism in Latin America and in Peru specifically during this period, using the U.S. as the yardstick for democracy seems problematic.
So, should I collect questions or should I answer right away? Okay,
I think you
so,
did.
okay, so I think that these are really good questions. The U.S. isn't really a yardstick for us. I think that in the one of the examples where electoral accountability is being criticized actually is for the U.S. because of U.S.'s engagement in significant abuses that are publicly acknowledged, and still the incumbents don't seem to be punished. The reason I brought up the U.S. Is simply because I think that a lot of us are well, all of us, well, not the ones that don't, not non-citizens that can't vote, but those of us that vote in the U.S., we have an expectation that we go to the polls and our vote is going to be recorded in the way that we cast it, and we're not going to meet with intimidation as we go to the polls. Is the U.S. an example of a democracy that we should, or of a democratic procedure that we should strive for? No, absolutely not. We all know there are all sorts of problems with elections in the U.S. So it's not a yardstick that I was measuring Peru against so much as just an example of, most of us have voted here. We have a reasonable expectation that our vote will count as it was cast, and that's really the measure that I'm interested in for this case. Now, the executive turnover. One of the things that's really important to remember about this project, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that this is not a theory that travels easily. You have to take extreme care, not just generalizing this theory from Peru to other countries, but even within Peru. So I would have to think very carefully in the next part of the project about how and if this is generalizable first to deputies and then to municipal elections, because conditions differ. This is even more important when you attempt to let this theory travel across countries. And there are many countries where it doesn't apply for a variety of reasons. One of them being that you won't have free and fair elections, whether that's because of lack of executive turnover, so that might not be an appropriate measure in those countries, or for a variety of other reasons. If you have elections where somebody is putting a gun to the head of the majority of the population and making them vote a certain way, even if you happen to have executive turnover, that's clearly not a free and fair election that we can account in as a country where we can do this type of analysis on. I think that there is good reason to think that Peru was sufficiently free and fair for the purposes that we want, that we're looking at it for. So what we want in Peru, or in our study, is a country where you as a voter, you can go to the polls and you can be reasonably certain that your vote is going to be recorded in the way that you cast it. And I think that argument is generally made. There was significant party competition in the 80s in Peru and up until the 90s. I wouldn't make that argument about the 1992 election or any election really after that until the 2000s, right? So I think that you have to be very, very careful, and I don't think that this theory can necessarily travel from country to country, and not even over time in Peru to all time periods.
I've got a couple questions, but I think the big one is, I'm just wondering, I'm sure you addressed this in the paper, but I mean, obviously, if I'm going to, whenever somebody casts a vote, in an election, they could be casting that vote for any number of potential reasons. So I'm thinking, like in the 1990 elections in Peru, you had, if I remember correctly, there was some economic turmoil at the time. And Fujimori, a lot of people argued, won because he was, a Western educated economist, or was trade. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate, but he was sort of the guy with the economic know-how. So, do you address like possible alternative explanations for why votes may, because there could have been any number of substantive reasons in 85 or 90 why votes changed beyond just violence occurring in the
Yes, we do. So you had, for example, before the 85 election, you had El Nino, you had massive economic troubles, which we think accounted in great part for the swing to the left and the center left in the 85 election. So we do think about that, but what we're saying is that all of the parties, including the incumbent, were subject to those same economic shocks. It might have played out differently in terms of who you were voting for with respect to the incumbent. If you're holding the incumbent responsible for the economy, then that's constant across the country. What we're looking for is an effect above and beyond that of just the number of people killed.
By province.
By province. But we also, what we're actually more concerned about is that there are significant demographic differences in Peru, and we're worried that there are some correlates that correlate with the demographic differences that might be accounting for our vote. Why are the indigenous, for example, is it possible that the indigenous are defecting from the left party for reasons other than the violence, whereas people elsewhere in the country are not doing that? And so we do a number of controls we do a number of sort of robustness checks in the paper, including a selection model, where we select out just areas where there's a high level of the indigenous, and then we run the test just on those levels, and we find the same results. But yes, we definitely did think about those. There are other alternative explanations. Propaganda, for example, did propaganda vary significantly between regions? Is there more propaganda against the left? We think about that, and we make the argument that may have been the case, but there's no reason to believe that within the areas where there was where the violence was highest, that the propaganda varied significantly, and therefore that can't account for the variance within the regions that experienced high violence in the number of votes that were lost. There was another, there are a number of alternative explanations that we bring up in the paper, and that's definitely one of them. The economy is definitely one of them, and economic differences in the country.
I'll just ask just a very quick question. On the graph you showed, you had on the x-axis, I think it was the number of deaths.
Yes.
Was that just aggregate, or is it like including possible insurgent committed by the insurgents and committed by the state?
Yeah. So one of the questions in this paper is how do you test who's committing the violence and what are the reactions to who's committing the violence? And one of the things that distinguishes Peru, and this brings my answer sort of back to this gentleman's question, which was, well, how does this theory travel? You have to think about the conflict, when you're testing this kind of thing, you have to think about the conflict dynamics within a country. And testing in different countries can be very different. So for example, if I were to take this theory to Bosnia, then I'd have to account for all of the different parties perpetrating violence, and that would get really complicated because they were so intermixed. In the Andes, the population that was victimized was largely concentrated, and there were two perpetrators, and the violence committed by these two perpetrators was largely symmetrical. So what we do is, in robustness tests, we separate out the perpetrators, and we test them separately. We test the effect of their violence, of the violence perpetrated by the perpetrators independently, separately. What I showed you was by either perpetrator, but we find substantively the same results when we separate them out and test for them separately. And Peru is a nice case because it allows us to look at this sort of in the aggregate, and separate them out, whereas that would be very, very complex under other conditions.
Could you please expand on the affiliation between Sendero Luminoso and the political parties? Because, I don't know, like, would you say, like, Barrantes was associated with the Sendero Luminoso? I don't think anybody will say, I mean, Barrantes was the leader of the Izquierda Unida. Or were there any politicians actually defending Sendero Luminoso in the ground? And also because Sendero was a very anti-systemic
Yes.
party, which actually was completely against any political system. And when they threatened the elections, they didn't threaten to vote for this way or the other way. It was like they were threatening to vote at all, like they didn't
Right.
want elections. So I don't know if you can expand more on that relationship.
So the story that we're telling is actually of voters defying. Well, so let me start with the relationship between the party and the Sendero Luminoso. No, there wasn't. So what happened was a very classic story of a violent offshoot of a political party that commits violence and is therefore an illegal entity and distances itself from the political party, and the party distances itself. All the politicians distance themselves very carefully from Sendero. The argument that we make is that that's common. If you have a violent faction that's illegal, no party in their right mind is going to say, well, yes, we represent them, because then they would be made illegal themselves and wouldn't be able to run. And so that's not enough reason for us to think that voters didn't associate the two. We have every reason to think voters did associate the two, because the violent faction is an offshoot of the party. They're operating in the same region. They largely adhere to the same ideology, although Sendero's is more radical. And Sendero did have this, have the aim to disrupt elections. So what we're saying is that voters that went to the polls, this is why we think this is a tough test of the hypothesis, because voters that go to the polls, they had to be defying Sendero's directives not to participate in the elections, and had to go anyway and cast their vote against the entity that was most close to the Sendero in terms of their ideological position and their program, even though it wasn't entirely the same program. So there were areas in the country where the elections were disrupted, for sure. We don't have voting results from those areas, but we think that this is a story of voters registering their preferences under the most difficult of conditions. The other thing to remember about Sendero is that Sendero had an incentive to, or they wanted to disrupt the functionings of the state. They wanted to disrupt the general function of the state. And so they wanted to disrupt elections, but they likely did not mind the incumbent being punished heavily at the polls, because one of their objectives was to overthrow the incumbent. We don't know that for sure. We haven't talked to members of the insurgency to sort of ask them what was your attitude about, or what were your sentiments about, the results after the 1985 or 1990 election. It would be very nice to do that. But we think that this is a fairly common story of a violent faction breaking off from a more moderate political party, and then the two distancing themselves from each other, but the voters not distancing themselves distancing these two entities in the same way.
Just a little comment about like what happened with like all of these majors from the left that were killed by Sendero. I mean, like that. I think that's a very sharp distinction.
All of the
Majors. I mean, there are majors, local
right.
authorities that were killed by Sendero.
Well,
even though they were from the left or from the Izquierda Unida, or even like more radical left.
Right, and you have more of that happening as the conflict goes on. So Sendero was actually, it's a really interesting and a complex story. Sendero was actually quite popular in the early 80s, leading up to the 1985 election. They became increasingly violent, and particularly between the 85 and the 90 election, that's when they became increasingly violent and started sort of targeting mayors and other political officials. So I can't comment on the local elections because I don't have those results yet. But I think it's going to be a really interesting study to look at precisely what happened locally, whether they were punished in the same way, whether it's likely that there was greater levels of voter intimidation in local elections because of them targeting local politicians, but that's sort of the next part of the project. But it's going to be a really interesting thing to see. And it's entirely possible that the story will be slightly different when we look at local elections. Yes.
So I'm going to challenge you on that just because it's so crucial to your causal story, the idea of a rebel-affiliated, insurgent-affiliated party, because Sendero was not affiliated, nor did it have strong or positive ties with the left as early as the late 70s when they decided that they were going internally that they were going to wage armed struggle. So there's evidence of the legal left, as it's called in Peru, actively countering at the local level Sendero and mobilizing people against the Shining Path. And this is widespread. This is at a national level. And so once that split happened and the left internally was aware of that, there isn't. This is the one case. This is not like Spain. This is not like Sinn Féin and the IRA. This is a very particular case where if you went to Peru and tried to make this case, I think you would face a lot of opposition from those people who experienced it in this conflict. That Sendero was not affiliated with the PCP or at that point. Because the other thing that I think is important to mention is that the Izquierda Unida was a new party. In 1985 was only the second election where some of those same actors in the coalition were competing. 1980 was the start of the armed conflict and when Sendero waged the struggle, but also it was the end of 12 years of military rule where there weren't any elections. So this is a very formative period for the left, and I think that dynamic at the local level is maybe less the effect of violence on voting, but this kind of iterative relationship between these different forms of contestation, between violence and politics, and the ways that these different actors wielded that. And my second point is a question. I was wondering how you calculated or estimated the territorial control, like government-controlled areas or areas where the left had a stronghold. Because again, IU didn't really have what you could consider like reliable strongholds, even by 1985, and there was so much temporal and spatial variation in how the parties performed, and also was where the violence happened. So I'm just interested in how you made that estimation.
So to start with the territorial control, We don't measure territorial control other than where the elections are being held, and the state is in control of the elections. And so there were areas where the state wasn't in control, and then elections weren't held, and so we don't include those. We don't include those provinces in the study. I've done a lot of research in Peru, and I think that in part the reason this story meets with resistance is because there is a very strong story about what happened in the elections in Peru, and the incumbent was punished and the incumbent was thrown out of office, and that happened twice. And I've been told by Peruvian analysts that there's nothing more to the story. I don't think that that's true, and the story at the local level was very much of Sendero recruitment of the local citizenry. And then the local citizenry, as the conflict intensified and the abuses increased, did turn against the Sendero. And that's generally the rondas are generally credited with turning the conflict around and being the major force behind why the Sendero was defeated in the mountains. So the story also is very well established of how the leftist party and Sendero distanced themselves from each other, and we're not disputing that they did. What we're saying is that we don't believe that the same distancing was made in the minds of the voters. We think that the voters, even if they weren't voting against Sendero per se, they were voting against an ideological position that the Sendero represented, and the party that came the closest to representing that was the PCP. And this is particularly stark when you compare what happened in Peru to neighboring countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, where I've also done quite a bit of research, where you sort of around the same time had significant indigenous mobilization that in great part took place through the left. And it's always puzzled people why the same didn't happen in Peru. And one explanation for that is that Sendero really managed to shoot the left in the foot and destroy the budding mobilization that could have otherwise occurred and did occur in Bolivia and in Ecuador. I mean, we acknowledge the fact that these two parties did attempt to distinguish themselves from each other. The story we're telling is that they were not successful in doing that in the mind of the voter. And the voter clearly is punishing the left for the violence that's occurring. But again, I mean, it's a complex story, and I appreciate you bringing up all of these nuances. I think that it's all the more interesting because it is so complex, and I'm very open to the possibility that this might play out very differently in local politics. But I think that empirically, that's something that remains to be seen.
I have a question regarding the fact that the vote was mandatory in Peru. Do you have any? Have you done any study or other studies that examine the extent to which the fact that the vote is obligatory changes the results of the election? In connection with this, I was wondering also that to what extent voters going to the polls in a situation of violence truly believe that their vote is going to be truly secret, or that they don't really care about the fact of that is that because it's difficult to perhaps for us to understand that idea. We take for granted that the vote is secret, but to what extent was this the case in Peru? And also, can we establish any sort of correlation between the number of blank votes and the fact that the vote was mandatory? Is that a reflection of this fact? Because we know that there is in every given population there is a number of people that who are not engaged in politics or who rather don't go vote. But the fact, so my question in other words is to what extent the fact that the vote was mandatory affected the results of the elections?
How did the mandatory vote affect the results of the election? Well, we do see that there are more people, well, let me rephrase that. So the argument has been made by others that the fact that the vote was mandatory contributed to larger turnouts in the Andes than it otherwise would have. A large number of those votes, most of those votes were not blank ballots. And so they were people casting their ballots for some particular party. How did the blank ballots affect the election and the fact that how did the fact that the vote was mandatory affect the election? I think that had the vote not been mandatory, we would have seen a lot fewer votes. And it's not entirely clear what it depends on what party you're interested in. So if you're interested in the incumbent was losing everywhere. And so even if nobody would have turned out in the Andes, the incumbent would have still lost. The incumbents just would have lost in different areas. He would have lost in Lima and in other areas where the vote wasn't heavy. I think that the fact that the vote was mandatory allows us to see the effect on the left. I think that had the vote not been mandatory, then the left would have won an even greater percentage of the vote because it was winning in 1985 in areas that weren't where violence wasn't being perpetrated. In 1990, it's not as clear what would have happened to the vote had to the left vote had the vote not been mandatory, because there was the left wasn't winning anywhere else. They were losing also, in part because they were splitting and in general they were bringing the question back to this gentleman's comments. There were other factors that were going on in the Peruvian political system. All of the system parties were being punished because they were all thought to have done very poorly in handling the conflict and prior economic conditions. And so I don't think that the fact that the vote was mandatory would have changed the overall results of the elections, but had it not been mandatory, this effect on the left vote likely would not have been visible to us. And the secret vote, we think that it depended. It depended how secret the vote was likely, or how confident the voter was that the vote was secret, likely depended on the province. And so that's what we think the blank ballots are measuring, that there was variation in how secret people thought the vote was. So in the strongholds of the left, where the Sendero was the strongest, because that's how originally they had their recruitment efforts had been. We think that in those provinces, it's likely that the vote was the least secret, or not that it was the least secret, but that people had the least confidence that it was going to be secret. And in the 1990 election, that was true for both the left and the center left, the incumbent party. So I think it varied greatly. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good measure of the faith that people had in the secrecy of the vote. We only have a reason to believe that there was, at least in most of the provinces, that there was that voters had a reason to believe that their vote was going to be secret, but that clearly varied.